Hi everyone, we should probably make a start. It's 8 p.m. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see all you here. Should introduce myself. I'm Robert Logie, Bob Logie, from the University of Edinburgh. I'm currently chair of the governing board of the Psychonomic Society, soon to pass on that responsibility to the current chair-elect, Kathleen Moore, who's just joining us. Before the keynote from Koriat, we have a few announcements to make. I wanted to give you a flavour, some of the highlights of what the Society's been doing this last year. And then we'll be having an announcement about the new journal, a new exciting project for the Society, very briefly. Then we'll have the presentation of the Early Career Awards, and then Janet Metcalf will introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. So just a few things to say. It's been an exciting time for the Society. The journals are generating a bit of income, and that has given the governing board the opportunity to implement a number of strategic initiatives over the last few years. Increasing the membership, international outreach, a variety of awards, and so on. And some of the initiatives are on the cycling slides that are shown here, and have been cycling as you've been gathering. I want to highlight a few of the initiatives and what we've been able to do of this last year. So membership, as many of you will know, we introduced the student membership category. And I'm delighted to tell you, over this last year, we have over 600 student members that we didn't have a year ago, and that's a real success. We introduced the fellow category and the member category instead of members and associate fellows. And overall, the membership has increased by 1,000 members just over the last few years. So we now have nearly 3,200 members of the Society compared to under 2,000 just 5 years ago. And that's incredible growth. There's been incredible growth too for the annual meetings. So in Long Beach last year, we had around 2,500 people. We're expecting around 2,700 at this meeting, perhaps a few more. So really exciting times for the Society. And then we've had a variety of activities on international outreach. The Society is primarily based in the US, but around a quarter of the membership come from outside of the US and Canada, notably from Europe, including myself, and elsewhere in the world. And so there was a feeling that we ought to have more outreach to members who are outside of North America, and one major initiative is to have an international meeting. Now, there was an international meeting in Edinburgh in 2007, but next year in Granada in Spain, Teresa Bajo, who's a member of the governing board, is organising the first of a series of international meetings of the Society. This will be in collaboration with CEPEX, the Spanish equivalent of Psychonomic Society, and the European Society for Cognitive Psychology. That'll be in Granada in Spain in early May next year, so I hope to see many of you there. In addition, we're now sponsoring a symposium at an international meeting, a non-Psychonomic Society international meeting each year. This year we had a very successful symposium on attention and working memory at the European Society for Cognitive Psychology meeting in Cyprus. And next year we'll be sponsoring a symposium at ICOM, the International Conference on Memory, in Budapest in Hungary. And there's been a call for proposals for a symposium for that. So do think about symposia you might like to propose for those activities. A number of publication highlights on the website have been appearing, thanks to Steve Lewandowski and his team. They've been selecting a variety of publications from the 6 journals of the Society, writing blog posts, highlighting the major interesting findings that are coming out in our journals, and gradually publicising the Society beyond the Society membership. And so more people know what psychonomics means, apart from the members themselves. We've sponsored a leading edge workshop. This is a new initiative just started this year, up to $50,000 available for a leading edge cross-cutting, cross-disciplinary workshop. The first of these on the process of explanation took place just a couple of weeks ago in Champaign-Urbana. And there will be a symposium based on that topic, process of explanation, during the meeting, and a special issue of Psychonomic Bulletin Review will be coming in due course on that. We've had a second call for leading edge workshops for next year, and the winner of that competition will be announced quite soon, and there'll be a further call in future years. All 6 journals have seen an increase in their impact factors, which is great to see. And in addition, we just discovered today that there have been over 2 million downloads of articles from the Psychonomic Society journals over this last year. Just a fantastic increase from just 3 or 4 years ago when they're under 1 million downloads. So that's really, and we're pretty sure it's not the authors downloading their own articles multiple times. Just about as much as I want to say to you, except I should announce that there are 1 or 2 errors in the program, particularly in the condensed program, that happened before we noticed these. One of those, and it's an important event that I should let you know about, there is a funding workshop. These are domestic opportunities for within the US from the National Science Foundation. There'll be a presentation tomorrow at noon, and also a presentation from the European Research Council to tell you about opportunities for international collaboration. And these funds are open to access by US citizens who are collaborating with European researchers, as well as with European researchers. So that's 12 noon tomorrow in Boulevard. It's mentioned in the main program, but it's missing from the condensed program. So I just want to make sure that you're all aware of that event tomorrow at 12. And we have a representative of the European Research Council here who's come from Brussels to this meeting especially to give a presentation, as well as representatives from the National Science Foundation. So that's enough for me, just to give you a few highlights of the exciting things that the Society has been able to do. But one very exciting thing that's happening is the launch of a new journal. And to tell you about that, I shall hand you over to the editor of said journal, Jeremy Wolfe.
Thank you. I'm totally delighted to be here to launch the new journal, which will be launched even more if somebody pops up the slide. Meantime, I'll do a little interpretive dance here. Well, let me tell you, if you haven't already noticed somewhere, that the journal is called Cognitive Research, Principles and Implications. That's a bit of a mouthful, so it's known affectionately as CREEPY. Well, there are other possibilities. We rejected the title of the journal that was going to be Cognitive Research, Applications and Principles. There we go. That looks much more encouraging. So let me tell you a little bit quickly about CREEPY. It's the first new journal that the Society has launched in many years. Like our other journals, it is going to be high quality. It is going to be peer-reviewed. Unlike any of our other journals, it will be fully open access. That will be a new experiment for the Society. It's got a terrific editorial team, 5 of whom I believe are here. And so if you know them, you should talk to them about the great paper that you're going to submit to this journal. Let me tell you what the purpose of this journal is. This journal is focused on use-inspired basic research. Let me explain what that means. So the way to explain that is to define a space. On the y-axis, we have relevance to the advancement of basic knowledge. On the x-axis, we have relevance for immediate applications. And you can ask yourself, where does your research fit into this? And we can have a little 2x2 table here. This is the place you don't want to be. Right, you can say that somebody else has, the paper you just reviewed lives in that quadrant. Many of us do most of our work in this quadrant, associated with Niels Bohr, perhaps. The idea is this is basic research driven by curiosity about the way the universe is put together. Down in the lower right, you could have a quadrant that you might associate with Thomas Edison. That's research that's really applied. How do you want to configure that dashboard? What should the color temperature of that light bulb really be? The upper left-hand corner is where most of our journals live now. In the Psychonomic Society, lower right-hand corner, there are numbers of applied journals. We're aiming for this quadrant that we can call Pasteur's quadrant. I'm borrowing that term, as many of you will know. The idea is these are problems that are drawn from the world. They are brought into the lab to be studied for their basic principles, and then perhaps those basic principles can be moved back to the world. But what we're publishing in Creepy is the use-inspired basic research. It's the sort of research where you can write a significance paragraph with a straight face. The idea of Pasteur's quadrant, I should credit to Donald Stokes, who wrote a book about that back in 97. What might be an example? So, in my own work, I'm interested in whether or not radiologists are influenced by the fact that when they're doing screening, they're looking for something that's very rare. Cancer only shows up 3 times in 1,000 in a screening population. Does that matter? Radiologists are hard to understand. I don't know, they're hard to understand. That's not what I meant. They're hard to run as subjects, but I can bring that problem into the lab and I can study it with non-radiologists, come up with principles that I can then translate back into clinical settings. Eyewitness testimony. There are interesting problems there. They don't always get the right guy. Why is that? Well, there are basic psychological principles having to do with the way we make decisions, having to do with the way we recognize faces. We can study those in the lab, and those results might transfer back. So again, it's going to be rigorously peer-reviewed. This is not going to be the journal that you get, the open access journal that you get, notes from twice a week saying, you can submit to the Journal of Toxicology or whatever. It's going to be fully open access, published electronically. Eventually, it will be funded by page charges like other open access journals. But importantly, if you submit a paper before December 31st of next year, there will be no fees. So start writing now. If you have questions about what might be appropriate, questions about the journal in general, talk to any of us on the editorial board or certainly send me an email. We look forward to having Creepy join the ranks of the already successful and important journals that the Society publishes. I look forward to your submissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And we should also tell you that the journal submission portal has been launched. It was on Tuesday, and I'm told that one person has already submitted a paper, so get in there quick before the journal gets filled up. So now I'd like to call on Lynn Reeder, who is the chair of our awards committee, to announce the winners of our Early Career Awards. Lynn Reeder.
So I'm very happy to have had the privilege of serving as the chair of the 2015 Early Career Awards, serving with Teresa Bayo, Patty Reuter-Lorenz, Jason Arndt, and John Henderson. This task was fun and also daunting, because I can tell you that all of the nominations for this Early Career Award seem deserving of this recognition. All of the nominees were excellent. The hard part was picking the very best of a wonderful set. As hard as it was, those that we selected are truly outstanding. Their accomplishments seem sufficient, to me at least, for promotion to full professor, so they can go to their department head. We should all follow their very promising careers. I'm going to give you a very brief description of each winner's work. There's a slightly larger description in the program. Since time is short, I just can give one comment about each winner. So I'll be presenting them in alphabetical order. The first winner is Sarah Brown Schmidt. Her work shows how extra-linguistic knowledge constrains linguistic choices. Sarah? The next winner is Daniel Casasanto. His work shows how a person's language affects cognitive judgments in other domains. Sort of seems like the flip of Sarah's. Daniel was also trained as an opera singer, so I hope in the future we can get him to perform here at the meetings. Daniel? Our next winner is Jessica Payne. Her work delves into what types of memories are consolidated during sleep and how sleep can unbind aspects of memory, teasing apart emotion from other aspects of the memory and relating this to traumatic memories. Jessica? So since Jeremy talked about Pasteur's quadrant, I noticed that Jessica seems to be right up there in that quadrant, as is the last one that I'll be naming, Frederick Verbruggen. He is the winner of the Stephen Yantis Early Career Award. His work addresses how people inhibit prepotent responses, and this has implications for individuals with disorders such as impulsivity. I need to talk to you. Okay, Frederick. So one last round of applause for all of our early career award winners.
Thank you, Lynn. We now go to the main event. But just before we do, I'd like to sort of say, as the first person from outside of North America to have been chair of the governing board, it's been an incredible privilege and honour to serve in that role. I hope I'm not the last European to take this role after the experience that people have had in the governing board. I very much look forward to passing over the burden to Kathleen Moore in January. Without more ado, I'll call on Janet Metcalf to introduce Asher Koriat as our guest speaker tonight.
It's a huge honor to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. You're going to hear from Asher Koriat, and he's going to talk about knowing that you know and its function. Asher has been a crucial person in the development of the field of metacognition in particular. And he's received honors all over the world. And so the first slide that I want to show you is him receiving some other honors. I mean, of course, none of those quite compare to being the keynote speaker at Psychonomics, but nevertheless, we're not alone in appreciating him. First of all, I want to just give you a little bit of an overview, as far as I can, about his life. So Asher was born in Morocco, and this is Asher when he was in elementary school. And you want to go back on that one? And high school. And when he was an undergraduate, and he then, this is him where he was an undergraduate, and then he went to Berkeley to be a graduate student. And so he was at Berkeley. And while he was at, and then he spent most of his life at the University of Haifa in Jerusalem. Asher is the only keynote speaker that Psychonomics has had who's an international speaker. So we're especially pleased to have him. And his career has been a series of brilliant pieces of work. He seems to come out with something new that's important roughly every 7 years. So his thesis was on creativity and the structure of memory, and I have to tell you, it was a bit of a hard read. But in that thesis, he focused on the difference between processes that are in your focal attention and those that are sort of unconscious that are impacting. And that interplay between those things that we're fully aware of and things that we now in metacognition think of being just on the verge of consciousness has been a theme of his career. He's had many, many publications, so I'm just going to mention the ones that I think are the hits. So the beginnings of his work on metacognition, his first paper in metacognition was on the tip of the tongue state. And people are still doing work on what a person who's in a tip of the tongue state knows that a person who's in a don't know state doesn't know. He did breakthrough work on overconfidence as a young, really young man. The overconfidence has now become a theme of the judgment and decision-making group. However, it was known back in 1980, and not only did Asher review this work, but he also came up with the methods to overcome overconfidence. He's done much theoretical work on metacognition. His accessibility model, which was published in Psych Review, spearheaded really well-articulated scientific work within the field, and it was really crucial in getting the field going. He's also done work on the control function of metacognition, again, a Psych Review paper that was widely cited. More recently, he's been doing work on the underconfidence with practice effect. So we thought that the norm was that people would be overconfident and that they were always overconfident. So to everyone's surprise, if you just do one more trial, they go underconfident. And there's been a huge upsurge of research on this finding. And there are many other important contributions, the work on easily learned, easily remembered, on the heuristic basis of metacognition, and on consciousness. He's a home run hitter, okay? For me, the most provocative and interesting of all these home runs is his recent work on consensuality and the self-consistency principle, which I think overturns all our ideas of what the structure of memory is like and how we access it. So again, another Psych Review paper. Koriat just keeps getting better and more interesting. So with that, I want to welcome him and let you listen to him rather than me. Thank you. It's a huge honor and the best honor that the Psychonomic Society gives.
Oh, do you hear me? Great. Janet, thank you very much for digging into my unconscious. I forgot all. Okay, I'm going to start with a small story. Just one second. In 1995, I was working on this paper, which appeared in JP General. I used several types of general information questions to investigate the feeling of knowing. And I decided in the last minute to give them some labels in order to facilitate the description. Then when I was about to submit the paper to JP General, I suddenly had the feeling that these labels are familiar to me. I didn't know who used them before. I couldn't remember in what context, and I thought that I could not submit the paper without giving proper reference to the author. It took me 3 days of agony before I remembered it was me who had used these terms 20 years earlier in a paper that appeared in Memory and Cognition on a completely different topic. I went back to that paper and discovered that actually that paper reported exactly the same pattern of results as the 1995 paper. The only difference was that the 1976 paper described a pattern of results that I thought actually indicates a kind of artifact that existed in a previous paper of mine that was published a year earlier in the same journal. Whereas in 1995, precisely the same pattern was derived from a theory. That's exactly what I predicted and found. Did I know in 1976 what I would be doing in 1995? I don't know. Actually, in my PhD thesis, which Janet reminded me of, I argued that when we engage in creative thinking, we usually operate on 2 levels of experience, searching at one level what we already know at some deeper level. And the deeper level is the one that leads the way. It's responsible for the continuity of our thought processes, and sometimes it is responsible for the obsession that we feel, coming back again and again to the same topics. The deeper level sometimes influences the course of the upper level, not necessarily by intruding into it, but by priming certain ideas and sometimes by sending certain messages in the form of intuitive feelings. What impressed me was the quality of these feelings. They are completely empty of content. You just feel that you are on the right track or that you are on the wrong track. And this is a bit strange because it seems as if there is somebody inside yourself that knows what is the right track, and it tells you about it. I had the impression that a similar process on a miniature scale takes place in the feeling of knowing. When you are not able to retrieve a name or a word from memory, sometimes you have a feeling that you know it, it's there, it's about to emerge into consciousness. And the question is, how do you know that you know it before you know it? That's what brought me into doing some research on metacognition, and in fact, the extensive work that has been carried out on metacognition has indicated that indeed a great many of the metacognitive feelings that we have originate from unconscious processes, and the processes are quite subtle, are quite delicate. In fact, if you see, this is what William James talked about when he mentioned the tip of the tongue. He said that the gap of one word is not the same as the gap of another word, but both of them are empty of content. By the way, this is quite a different process from the metaphor that Freud has been using, in which unconscious memories emerge full-fledged into consciousness. Here we have really subtle feelings, and that's the mode by which unconscious processes communicate themselves to consciousness. I proposed a crossover model of subjective experience, which assumes that a subjective experience which lies at the heart of consciousness is actually shaped by unconscious processes, Usually, unconscious processes give rise directly and automatically to behavior. But when they form subjective feelings of different sorts, metacognitive feelings, perceptual feelings, emotional experience, that experience can now serve as the basis for controlled action. So one of the functions of subjective experience is to expand the range of actions over which we have some degree of control. Today, I'm going to talk about one feeling, one metacognitive feeling, subjective confidence. As you know, confidence judgment have been used extensively in many different areas, mostly in perception, psychophysics, judgment and decision-making, memory and metacognition, and other areas as well. One basic observation about confidence judgments is that people can generally discriminate between correct and wrong answers, which means that the correlation between confidence and accuracy is generally quite high. In fact, in some areas, it's so high to the extent that people take confidence judgments at their face value and use confidence judgments in modeling the processes underlying judgments. I was interested in the question of the accuracy of confidence judgments in the early paper that I mentioned in 1995 in a very unusual context. There were a few findings which indicated that natural languages embody a kind of universal symbolism to the extent that people who do not know a language can guess the meaning of words in that language. And I thought that this is like what philosophers sometimes talk about in connection with intuition. You just know and you don't know why you know it. So I thought maybe people have also some intuitive feelings about the accuracy of their intuitive feelings. So what I did was the following task. I borrowed the list of words, of antonyms from 3 different languages, and the list had been prepared by Dan Slobin. All I did was to ask people to indicate their confidence when they match the foreign words from the English word with the English words. So I asked them to indicate their confidence for each item on a 4-point scale. The results were the following. First of all, correct matching average 58%, which is highly significant. What happened to confidence judgments? Surprisingly, there was a nice correlation, quite strong correlation between confidence and accuracy. Now, notice that when people gave a rating of 4, their performance averaged 66%, which is quite remarkable. So you take a person, one of your subjects, and you ask him, by the way, have you heard of a language called Yoruba? And he says, no, never. At the end of the experiment, you prove to him that not only does he know some Yoruba, he can also monitor his knowledge of Yoruba. So what is happening? As soon as the paper was accepted, I thought, what the hell, maybe there is an artifact in that study, and you can guess what it is. The artifact is the following. The study has 2 findings: object-level performance and meta-level performance. Object-level performance means that most people agree on the correct answer, which happens to be this one. So the correct answer is the one that is consensually selected. Now, when we move to meta-level, we found that confidence is correlated with correctness. However, the relationship between correctness and consensuality creates a confounding. We are not sure that what confidence judgments are monitoring is the correctness of the answer or the fact that most people give that answer. Perhaps you are confident simply because you choose the answer that most people give, regardless of its accuracy. Why you should do that, I don't know, but you have to check to make sure that that's not what is happening. So in order to check that possibility, I went through the literature, selected enough items for which people happen to agree on the wrong translation, and prepared a new list with more items, more languages, and the results were the following. First of all, on the basis of the result, I divided the items into 3 categories: consensually correct, these are the representative items; and the and consensually wrong, those that are in which people agree on the wrong translation, and then non-consensual items which were in between. The results were as follows. For the consensually correct items, the correlation was, of course, positive. People were more confident when they gave the correct answer, like in the previous paper. For consensually wrong items, the correlation was just the opposite. People were much more confident when they gave the wrong answer. And of course, for the non-consensual answer, there was nothing. So the results are clear-cut, showing that people do not have access to the correctness of their guesses. In fact, they do have access to the correctness of their guesses, but only when their guesses are better than chance. Otherwise, you get just the opposite. I remember that when I submitted this paper, the action letter was not flattering. What the editor said, well, I have no choice but to accept this paper because you are correcting an error in the previous paper. Fortunately, it was too late for him to retract the earlier paper. So what was an error in 1976 was actually an interesting finding in 1995, where I examined the relationship between feelings of knowing and the ability to guess the word that you are looking for from among several distractors. The correlation was positive and nice for consensually correct items, defined, by the way, differently than in the original, in the 76 paper, but it was negative for consensually wrong answers. So you see exactly the same pattern. I went on to see whether exactly the same pattern will be obtained for a simple general information task. And the task was simple. We had questions like the one that you can see there, and people had to indicate their confidence. Of course, I made sure to include a few deceptive items, consensually wrong items. So I divided the items again on the basis of the results into two categories, consensually correct, consensually wrong, and the results were exactly the same. Notice that what happens here, if you take so-called deceptive items, the people who give the correct answer are the least confident, which is really strange. I mean, they know the answer. Why they are confident? I mean, you'd expect that people who are deceived will be less confident than those who know the answer. In this case, we were able also to collect response time data, and it's exactly the same thing. Notice that faster response times are on top, so you get a positive correlation in the case fast responses in the case of consensually correct items, but the opposite for consensually wrong items. I went on to check whether the same thing happens for perceptual judgments. As you know, for perceptual judgments, people take the accuracy of confident judgments for granted. But I used a task that was a little bit more complex. This is the task. People had to guess which of two lines is longer. Then on the basis of the results, again, the same procedure, I divided the items into those that were consensually correct and those that were consensually wrong, and the results were the following, exactly the same thing. For response time, exactly the same thing. I replicated the results with another task in which people simply had to judge which of the two shapes has a larger black area, and again, you get exactly the same pattern and exactly the same pattern for response times. I have a few more experiments that yielded exactly the same pattern. Trust me, it replicates itself. So what is happening? It seems that we discriminate between correct and wrong answers only because our answers tend to be correct by and large. And other people have shown a similar patterns. Now, look at this continuum. In fact, in most, probably in all studies in which confidence judgments have been collected, the items come from the region that you can see in which people are by and large correct in their responses. And in fact, you can even assume that what is happening is that people have direct access to the correctness of their knowledge. However, when you look at what is happening for the region where performance is below chance, you get a completely different story. And in fact, what you get there is not simply a zero correlation, you get a negative correlation. So if we had enough items to cover the entire range, what we will get is a U-curve describing the association between confidence and accuracy. How do you handle such data with signal detection? I have no idea. So, of course, the consensually wrong items are the exception. And perhaps they prove the rule. But what is the rule? We might get some insight from philosophy. After all, philosophers were the first to ask the question, how can we be certain about our own beliefs? There are two basic theories of truth, and I have to simplify matters here. One is the correspondence view, and the other one is the coherence view. The correspondence view simply says, I'll go back. The correspondence view simply says that in order for a belief to be true, it must correspond to reality. However, as Kant has said, the only thing I can do is to judge whether my knowledge of the object agrees with my knowledge of the object. That is, I don't have any extra knowledge about the object apart from what I know about it. In a sense, what he says, the only thing that I can evaluate is the consistency of my own knowledge. And indeed, other people, those who argued for the coherence view, said that for a belief to be justified, it must belong to a coherent system of beliefs. Now the question is, how do these two theories or two views apply when we make inferences about the outside world? Let's assume that we have the following question. I would like to know whether among married couples, husbands are more satisfied of their marriage or wives are more satisfied. What do? I collect, I sample a group of couples, I examine what happens, and I find out that the husbands are more satisfied. My conclusion at the object level is probably in the population out there, husbands are more satisfied of their marriage. However, I switch now to the question about the meta level. I want to know how sure I am that that's indeed true of the population. Now what happens is that I don't care any longer about correspondence. All I care about is what is happening within the sample. All I care about is the coherence within the sample. So in a sense, coherence becomes a cue for correspondence. For example, if I find that in the 90% of the couples, husbands are more satisfied, I am pretty sure that what I see in my sample is true of the population. So when I shift from object level to meta level, in fact, I shift from correspondence to coherence. So what happens is that reliability or coherence become a cue to validity. Now, precisely the same thing takes place in subjective confidence. The idea is the following. We are stuck in the middle between the external world and the internal world, and we don't have access to the truth of our knowledge coming from either source. So how do we judge our confidence about general information questions? I do exactly the same thing as I do when I have to sample information from the outside world. The only thing that I do, which is different, I sample information from within. So the first thing is sampling a few cues from memory. Of course, I cannot sample too many cues. And this is critical because I have to aggregate information across the cues. I also probably don't have to sample the cues sequentially because I cannot draw the entire sample all at once. Then all I do is I base the decision on the balance of evidence in favor of the two options, and I'm trying to make it really simple. And then confidence is based on self-consistency. For example, if I draw 7 cues and all 7 point in one direction, of course I will be more confident than if I draw only 4 that point in one direction out of the 7. Now, you might argue that there is a basic difference between drawing a random sample from the outside world and drawing samples from within. Because when you draw a sample from the outside world, you expect everybody else to draw a sample from the same population, and therefore you expect some replication. However, there is plenty of data indicating that, in fact, in many domains, people sample their cues from a population of cues that is largely shared by people with the same experience. And this comes from the wisdom of crowds work, so that in fact you might expect that most people by and large sample their cues from the same population. So let's see what happens in that case. Let's assume that we have an item for which 70% of the cues point towards the red option. Then one person might draw 7 cues, and of course the majority points in the direction of the red, and the decision is red. Another person might draw another sample, and in fact the majority is blue, and he might arrive at the blue decision. You can show easily that in that case 87% of the subjects will reach the majority decision, whereas only 13 will reach the minority decision. So when you have 70% of the cues pointing in one direction, 87 of the participants will choose that option, the majority option. You can also show that the majority option will be associated with higher confidence than the minority option, for the simple reason that in this case, for example, you cannot draw 7 out of 7 cues pointing in the wrong direction, actually in the direction of the minority option. In fact, you can see that the likelihood that 6 or 7 cues favor the red option is 0.33, whereas the likelihood that they will favor the blue one is almost 0. So you should be much more confident if you happen to choose the majority option. Now, we can easily derive, I won't go through it, I add one more assumption, excuse me, that let's assume, just to simplify matters, that you draw 7 cues sequentially, but you stop if 3 in a row favor the same answer. Then the prediction should be the following. What you see below is the percentage of people who choose the majority option, and you can see that the confidence should be much higher for those who choose the majority option than for those who choose the minority option, with the difference increasing as a function of the consensus, of the number of people, the percentage of people who choose the majority option. The same thing should happen with response time when we infer response time from the number of cues that he had to sample before making a decision. This is quite simple. The model derives from a very simple, probably incorrect or crude model. Let's see whether our results conform to these predictions. This is what happens for the word matching results from 1976. You know, there is some noise, it's not perfect, but still, you can see a systematic difference between majority and minority options. These are the results for the general information questions. Again, the same pattern. I try to see whether there is a difference between those who know more and those who know less. Those who know less are this. Those who know more are a little bit more confident, but exactly the same pattern. Try to see what happened with the perceptual judgments. Same pattern, same pattern. It repeats itself. Now, you might have noticed that I started with a question about the accuracy of confidence judgments, but then switched to the question about the basis of confidence judgments. This question about the basis can actually be applied to situations in which the answer doesn't have a truth value. For example, attitudes, beliefs, preferences, categorization, anything. In fact, if we take attitudes, in recent well, these are some of the questions that we used. For social beliefs, we ask questions that are taken from typical questionnaires. Old people are usually stubborn. You have to decide true or false, indicate your confidence. Or social attitudes, death penalty, favor, oppose, and then make a confidence, or which sport activity would you prefer, or category membership, is olives a fruit, and so on. Now, it's interesting that in recent years, social psychologists with regard to attitudes have been arguing the following: that when you present a subject with an attitude question, he does not simply retrieve a ready-made answer, but he constructs the answer on the spot, depending on the information that is accessible at the time of the judgment. If so, we might expect that confident judgment would provide some information about the underlying process. So we conducted these experiments, and you see all of them yielded precisely the same pattern. Of course, quite noisy. Now notice the assumption underlying these results is that even for attitudes for which people differ, people sample their cues from more or less the same population. And the same is true for beliefs, for preferences, and so on. Let's take as an example the category membership decisions. We ask people, I'm sorry, this is for response speed, I forgot. For the same data that I presented before, you see exactly the same pattern. Now, we use the following task, and just to explain what we did. You ask a person, is egg an animal? What do people do? In my view, they free associate. They take whatever comes to mind. And their confidence and their decision depends, again, on the consensus within the sample that they found. You can see here, people say eggs can be eaten just like animals. I mean, it sounds very logical. I mean, you take whatever comes to mind, and you make your decision. And in fact, what you get is exactly the same pattern that we saw before. What is interesting is very few people ask the question why different people give different answers to the same question. There is plenty of work on differences between items, which this is the typicality effect. But even within the typicality effect, if you present the same question to different people, some people give a different answer. And you can see here that you can track those people who give the deviant answer by their confidence judgments. And probably confidence says something about the process underlying the majority choice also. So it's based on sampling from more or less the same population. What happens if we present the same items again and again? We presented these items about 100 or so, 7 times in different days, and what you get is exactly the same pattern. Here we divided the items in the responses into those that were more frequent across the 7 presentations and those that were less frequent, and people, of course, were, as expected, less confident when they gave their less frequent response. Now, exactly the same pattern holds true for all the other tasks. So, going back to the question that philosophers ask themselves, how can we be certain about our own beliefs? Unfortunately, I think that Kant was correct. We cannot do better than judge whether our knowledge of the object agrees with our knowledge of the object. This is the basis of our confident judgment. So what we have available is internal coherence, reliability, self-consistency, whereas what we want to do is monitor correspondence, validity, correctness, truth. And in fact, the discrepancy between confidence, between internal coherence and correspondence is what explains the fact that the relationship between confidence and accuracy is not monotonic, but is a kind of U-curve because you get coherence in both extremes of the continuum that I plotted. So you can ask the question, what is confidence good for? What confidence is good for, it predicts replicability. because it's based on coherence. Therefore, it should do a good job in predicting replicability. And in fact, you might think about the following situation. You ask a person, how confident are you in your answer? What the person actually does, he asks himself, what is the likelihood that if I'm presented with the same question the second time, I will reach the same decision? This is what underlies confidence judgment. You can think about it in the following way. Suppose that you go to a new restaurant. The best way you can summarize your experience is to ask yourself, what is the likelihood that they will come back again? And this is true of confidence judgment also. Now we can check whether confidence indeed predicts replicability, and these are the results that you get for category membership decisions. Confidence in the first presentation of an item predicts the likelihood that you will repeat the same response across the next 6 presentations. The same thing happens for response speed. The faster you are, the more likely you are to repeat the same response. Now, what is quite interesting is the following. Across 7 tasks, we found that your confidence predicts the likelihood that other people will make the same choice. The more confident you are, the more likely it is that the choice that you made will be made by others. The difference is significant for each of these tasks. I should stress that what is important here are not individual differences, are not item differences, it's differences between different decisions. So the choice that you make, if you were confident in that choice, it predicts better what other people will do because it taps collective wisdom, the wisdom out of which other people draw their own samples. And this has a lot of implications. Now, there is one more finding. I think Janet mentioned the overconfidence that has been observed and studied in many tasks. The overconfidence, in my view, derives precisely from the discrepancy between coherence and correspondence. We base our confidence on reliability as a cue for validity, but reliability is always higher than validity. So you can ask yourself the question, suppose that we evaluate confidence judgments not against accuracy, but against replicability, some index of replicability. For example, the likelihood that the person will repeat the same answers next time around, or the likelihood that other people will make the same response, then you don't get that much overconfidence. You get a little bit. But the majority of the overconfidence effect derives from this discrepancy. So what we have done, in fact, is we focused on cross-person agreement and within-person agreement. Both of them seem to be diagnostic of the within-sample coherence on average, and therefore both of them are correlated with confidence. We found that in some areas where there exist reliable individual differences, for example, attitudes, within-person agreement is more diagnostic of coherence than is cross-person agreement. But by and large, both of them are doing a good job in predicting confidence. So confidence is based on similar processes, whether information is sampled from the outside world or from one's own memory. In both cases, the cue is reliability or self-consistency, and confidence monitors replicability. Now, some behavioral implications of what I have just described. The first has to do with group pressure and conformity. There were a few studies which indicated what is called the minority slowness effect. The idea is that if a person expresses a minority opinion, he usually hesitates, inhibits his response, therefore he should be slower in responding. And therefore we should expect slower responses for minority responses than for majority responses, with the difference increasing as a function of the size of the majority. And indeed, Basili and a few others found consistent support for these predictions. We tried to see whether that's what we get in our results. And in fact, we summarized the results across 8 experiments, including some by other people. This is exactly what you see. So it's a nice support for the minority slowness effect. That's majority versus minority responses, but this should be familiar to you, because that's what we have been finding in our studies for deciding which line is larger when people perform the task entirely individually. And of course, that's what we find also across 7 experiments for confidence judgments. And our argument was that this has nothing to do with conformity, at least not in our results. That's exactly what you should get as a result of the process by which you reach a decision and form your confidence in that decision, regardless of the influence of a group. We have a paper in which we summarized a large amount of data with Shiri Adiv and Norbert Schwartz, and the title says it all. Views that are shared with others are expressed with greater confidence and greater fluency, independent of any social influence. The point is that the pattern that you get, which derives from an internally driven mechanism, mirrors precisely what you should get as a result of group pressure. And in fact, it also has should have the same effects as group pressure. For example, one of the influential theories is the spiral of silence. The general idea is that individuals who hold a minority view feel pressure to remain silent. Therefore, there should be convergence of public opinion on the commonly shared position. Exactly the same thing should take place independent of any social pressure. Because when you are confident, you tend to speak up. When you are hesitant, you don't do anything with it. Therefore, we should expect convergence of public opinion on the commonly shared positions, regardless of any group influence. In fact, what we found is the following. If you make a majority view, if you make a majority response, you should feel more confident, you should make it faster, even if you have no idea what others choose, even if you have the wrong idea about what others choose, simply because of the fact that you are confident when you choose the majority opinion, you actually choose from the same place that other people select their own opinion. Another implication is for group decisions. I came across a study that appeared in Science, and the conclusion was 2 heads were definitely better than 1, provided they were given the opportunity to communicate freely. And what the study did was simple. 2 subjects sat together. They had to make a perceptual decision. Each of them made the decision individually, and then both of them argued with each other in order to come up with a joint decision. And the joint decision was much better, was more accurate than the individual decisions. I tried to see whether I could replicate these results without the 2 members speaking to each other. And the procedure was very simple. The assumption is, we know that participants are can generally discriminate between correct and wrong decisions, at least for the representative items. I expected that the same should be true across 2 members of a dyad. So the one who is more confident should be the one who is correct in the decision. Also, we know that confidence drives action. So I expected that what should happen is that group decisions should be dominated by the more confident individual. Now you can simulate the results. And what I did was to try what I call the maximum confidence slating. Subjects were run individually, then I formed virtual dyads, and then for each dyad and for each item, I simply selected the response of the person who was more confident and generated a dummy high confidence individual, aggregating all these high confidence judgments across items. In the same way, I created the dummy low-confidence individual and then a high-performing individual. I simply classified the two subjects into one subject who did better than the other. Now, across 3 experiments, you find that the dummy high-confidence individual outperformed the best of the 2 members of a dyad. So you can easily simulate a situation in which 2 heads are better than 1. Also, I analyzed the data that I mentioned earlier with lines and shapes and general information questions using exactly the same thing, except that I focused first on the consensually correct items, which are the more representative. Again, as you understand, I didn't have to run the experiments. I simply reanalyzed data that I happen to have. And again, in each case, the dummy high confidence subject performed better than the best of the 2 members. Now, this is a very nice and simple algorithm. We showed that 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads are better than 2, and you can go on. Anyway, you don't have any group discussion, you run the subject individually. What happens here is that you collect information that takes advantage of collective wisdom. What happens when the crowd is not wise, as occurs with the consensually wrong items? What happens is the following. You can see now the dummy high confidence individual produces the worst accuracy. It's worse than the worst individual. In fact, for these items, the best performance is achieved by the dummy low confidence individual. It's as if what the group should do is for each item, follow the advice of the person who is the least confident. I'm not sure that groups can do that. Now, there was this paper appeared in Science, and there was some argument that we are probably incorrect, because what happens in a group is sometimes you can convince somebody who is really confident when you bring an argument that is really convincing. So we try to see what happens if you have actual groups. So what we had, we presented in 2 experiments. People had to make the decision individually, then they discussed the matters between them, reached a joint decision, and then indicated their confidence in the joint decision. There was one task involved perceptual judgment, the other involved general information questions, and the results were the following. First of all, the simulation using the dummy high confidence subject produced exactly the same pattern as before. Dummy high confidence performed better than individual performance in the case of consensually correct items, but worse in the case of consensually wrong items. What happened for the joint decision? Indeed, the joint decision was much better than even than the dummy high confidence individual in the case of consensually correct items. What happened for consensually wrong items? It made things even worse. So, in fact, what happened when people discussed matters between them, their accuracy went down, and at the same time, they became more confident in the joint decision. So, in fact, they increased the tendency to act on that wrong decision. So in this case, what happens if when you make people talk to each other is you only make things worse. So why do you get this pattern? Confidence-based decisions and group deliberations have the same effect. They create convergence on the collective wisdom. So when the individual operates better than chance, both types of processes should improve performance. When individuals perform worse than chance, they make things even worse. And this is exactly what you would predict from the self-consistency model. Now, one more thing, and here I really need your help because I'm not sure whether what I'm going to say is trivial. You all know what the hindsight bias is. The hindsight bias is very difficult to overcome. I'll ask you a simple question, and then I'll ask you a second question later. The question is the following, and what I would like you to answer is what is the correct answer, not what people feel like doing as a result of hindsight. The question is the following. 2 retrospective studies were set to determine which of 2 treatments, A or B, for a certain type of cancer yielded a higher survival rate after 5 years. Study 1 found a higher survival rate for treatment A, but the difference was not significant. Study 2 found a higher survival rate for treatment B, and the difference was statistically significant. Should we trust better the results of study 2 just because the study happened to yield statistically significant difference? Now, how many of you say yes? Please try to raise your hand. How many of you say no? Please collaborate. I cannot see. Oh, my goodness. Well, so what's the answer? Let me give you one second question. 2 polls, exactly the same. 2 polls were conducted. This is quite actual, conducted during a race between 2 candidates for the U.S. presidency. In each poll, a random sample of potential voters of the same size was used. One sample yielded an advantage for candidate A, whereas the other yielded an advantage for candidate B. Assuming that the 2 samples were equivalent on a priori grounds, can we tell in retrospect, based on the results, which of the 2 samples is the more trustworthy? The answer to both questions is yes. And the reason for that, and I don't know whether you are surprised or not, the reason for that is exactly what I told you. For subjective confidence can discriminate between majority and minority responses. Which means that it can discriminate between representative samples and non-representative samples. Now, I argue that the same thing is true for statistical level of confidence because subjective confidence actually can be modeled after statistical level of confidence. I try to see whether the same is true for statistical level of confidence, and of course it is true. And it's very simple to prove. To show you just an example why it's simple why it's trivial and also correct, and people are not aware of it. I want to know whether men or women live long. That's what I wanted to know, whether the men or women live longer. I used the database for Israel, and I drew 1,000 samples of 50 men and 50 women. The results indicate the following. Of course, the majority of samples yielded the correct answer, which is women live longer. And there were a few samples, a minority, that yielded the wrong decision. But you can see that the representative samples yielded a significant result in 34% of the cases. Whereas the minority samples didn't yield significant results in any of them. I mean, none of them yielded a significant result, which means that statistical significance discriminates between correct and wrong decisions reached on the basis of the same random sampling. In fact, you can see that the T ratio correlated 0.36, which was highly significant with the accuracy of the sample-based binary decision. So the point is that both, this is what I call the hindsight paradox. Random samples of the same size are not equally credible. After drawing 2 samples randomly from the same 2-value population, we can tell in retrospect which of the 2 samples is more likely to be representative of that population if the 2 samples yielded different results. So confidence, either statistical or subjective, predicts which of the 2 results is the more likely to be replicated. And what is the paradox is that a random event, a random sample that turned out one way or the other carries the signature of the likelihood that it should have turned out that way. Paradoxically, the outcome of a random process discloses the quality of that outcome. I think that this is surprising, but I don't know what you think about it. Thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation to that talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Asher. I think that we can say with considerable confidence that the governing board knew this was going to be a good talk. And I'm sure also that there'll be a consensual agreement this evening that it has been a really great talk. So thank you very much indeed, Asher. There's now a reception with drinks and some snacks in the Continental Ballroom, which is immediately below us. I look forward to seeing you all there. I'm sure that Asher will be able to answer questions and have a discussion with you if you can get a hold of him. So thank you all for coming.